Imagine this. August 1941. 3,000 meters in the air. Beneath the wings of one plane, 5 others are hanging. They are alive. There are pilots inside them. They are ready to detach. This isn't science fiction. It's not a secret laboratory from a movie. This really happened. And the plane that carried them all was called the TB-3. Have you ever heard of the Soviet Union's flying aircraft carrier? A machine that changed the very concept of what was possible in midair. Most people haven't, and that's exactly why we're here. Today, I'm going to tell you a story that isn't in the textbooks. The story of one engineer, one wild idea, and one giant plane that became something far greater than just a machine. Stick around until the end, because the most incredible part comes toward the finale, I promise. But first, we need to meet the man where it all began. There are people who see the world not as it is, but as it could be. Vladimir Sergeyevich Vakhmistrov was exactly that kind of person. A military engineer, quiet, methodical. The kind of man who doesn't give grand speeches, but simply sits down at a desk and starts drawing. In the early 1920s, he worked within Soviet aviation structures, back when aviation was still in its infancy, when every new plane felt like a miracle, when pilots were heroes and engineers were wizards. And it was then that Vakhmistrov began to think about a problem. A simple one, almost obvious, but no one had tried to solve it this way before. The problem was this. The fighters of that time were fast and maneuverable, but they had one critical flaw, a short operational range. They simply couldn't fly very far. They didn't have enough fuel, which meant they couldn't protect bombers deep inside enemy territory. You're likely familiar with this problem from naval aircraft carriers. The ship carries the planes to where they can't fly on their own. Then it launches them. They do their job. They return. Vakhmistrov thought, why not do the same thing, but in the air? It sounds simple, right? On paper, yes. But imagine trying to convince the Soviet military command of this in 1930. People who were used to straightforward solutions, to proven schemes, to things that were already flying and already working. Vakhmistrov wrote reports. He compiled calculations. He showed up to meetings with blueprints tucked under his arm. They listened. They nodded. And nothing happened. This went on for years. And then something changed. Maybe the right person was in the right office. Maybe the calculations finally seemed convincing. Or maybe the stars just aligned. In 1930, Vakhmistrov received permission for the first test. But, and here's where it gets interesting, the permission came with a condition. No publicity, no gossip, one plane, one pilot, and complete secrecy. No one was supposed to know what they were working on. Imagine being in his shoes. You've spent years proving your idea works. And finally, you're told, okay, try it, but quietly, so no one sees, so no one laughs if it fails. This was 1930, and the next few months became perhaps the strangest in the history of Soviet aviation. But to understand what they were testing, we need to get to know the ship itself. The machine without which all of this would have been impossible. The plane that was once the largest in the world, and that bore a name that became a legend. There are planes that fly, and there are planes that press down on the earth with their mere presence. The TB-3 was the latter. When it rolled out onto the airfield, people would stop. They just stood and stared. Because it was hard to believe. Because such a thing shouldn't have existed. Not in 1930. Not made of metal and wood. Not with 4 engines, each roaring so loudly that you couldn't talk nearby. Let me give you a few numbers. Not dry ones, but numbers that help you feel the scale. The wingspan of the TB-3 was 41 meters. That's the length of almost 4 double-decker buses parked end to end. Imagine that flying over you. The takeoff weight, about 20 tons. That's roughly the weight of 4 African elephants. And all of that lifted into the air. The crew, up to 11 people. 11. This isn't a plane, it's a flying house. But what truly stunned contemporaries, and what set the TB-3 apart from everything before it, was the wing. Or more precisely, what was inside the wing. It was so thick, so massive in cross-section that there was a technical corridor inside. A real one. A mechanic could crawl through it during flight and service the engines right there in the air. Think about that. The plane is flying at 2,000 meters. Outside, there's a roaring wind and freezing cold. And inside the wing, a man with tools is tightening bolts and checking the oil. This isn't science fiction. This was standard procedure. The lead designer of the TB-3 was Andrei Nikolaevich Tupolev, a man whose name would later become synonymous with Soviet aviation. He and his team created a machine that was years ahead of anything else in the world. The first flight took place in December 1930. Test pilot Gromov lifted the giant into the air, and those watching from the ground said later that it looked like a mountain tearing itself away from the earth. Western aviation experts, upon learning of the TB-3, refused to believe the specifications. Some called the Soviet data propaganda, until they saw it themselves. But here's the thing. For all its grandeur, the TB-3 had one problem. A huge one. Almost impossible to fix. It was slow. Very slow. By combat aviation standards, it was catastrophically slow. A top speed of about 200 kilometers per hour meant one thing. Any fighter of that era could catch it with little effort. The TB-3 was a giant, but a defenseless giant. A huge target that sailed majestically through the sky and couldn't escape an interceptor. The military understood this. Tupolev understood this. Everyone understood this. And it was here, in this weakness, that Vakhmistrov didn't see a problem. He saw a solution. If a giant can't protect itself, it must carry its protection with it, right on board, right under the wings. This was the very thought that changed everything. And now that you know both the man and the machine, it is the right time to see what happened when they met. When theory finally collided with reality. When Vakhmistrov walked onto the airfield with secret permission in his pocket and ordered them to begin. December 1931, a Moscow airfield. Morning. The air is so cold that breath instantly turns to steam. Mechanics in sheepskin coats are working around the landing gear. No one else is allowed on the field. No spectators, no photographers, only those who need to know. In the middle of the field stands the TB-3, huge, dark. Under its fuselage, hanging on a special trapeze, is a small I-4 fighter. It looks like a chick beneath the belly of a giant bird. Absurd. Almost funny, if it weren't so serious. The fighter pilot climbs into the cockpit. The TB-3 pilot takes his seat. Vakhmistrov stands to the side with a notebook. He doesn't show his nerves, but his fingers grip his pencil a bit tighter than usual. The TB-3 engines start one after another. The roar builds. The ground trembles. And the giant begins its run. Think about this moment. A large plane accelerating down the runway, and underneath it hangs another plane, with a living person inside. No one in the world had ever done this before. No one knew exactly what would happen. Calculations are calculations, but reality is something else entirely. The TB-3 breaks away from the ground, slowly, heavily, but it lifts. The I-4 pilot feels the ground drop away, but he didn't take off. He was lifted, like cargo, like a package. That sensation, it was completely new. Not like anything else. The planes gain altitude. Everything is working. The trapeze is holding. The aerodynamics don't present any surprises. Yet. Then the order comes over the intercom. Ready? Ready. Detach. A click, and the I-4 falls, just for a fraction of a second. And then the engine catches, and the small fighter pulls away, alive and controlled. Vakhmistrov watches the sky. He says nothing. Then he writes a few words in his notebook. It worked. 3 words. But behind them, years of work. Years of convincing. Years of skeptical looks at meetings. In the official report on the first tests, Vakhmistrov wrote a sentence I want to quote, because it sounds like an engineering document, but reads almost like poetry. He wrote, essentially, "The concept of aerial basing is practically confirmed. Further development is expedient." That was it. No celebration, no exclamation marks, just expedient. But that single word opened the next chapter. The testing continued. In 1932, new flights. The system is refined. The trapeze is reinforced. The procedure for dropping is practiced under different conditions, at different speeds, in different winds. Each flight, new data. Each flight, one step closer to what seemed impossible. And that was when Vakhmistrov asked himself the question every real engineer asks after their first success. What if more? One fighter under the fuselage was proof of concept. That's good. But what if 2? What if 3? What if 5? That question started the next phase of the project. A phase that turned a modest experiment into something that took the breath away even from seasoned aviation experts. When an idea starts working, it's hard to stop. After the first successful tests, Vakhmistrov got something he didn't have before: funding, time, and, most importantly, carte blanche for experiments. And he started experimenting. The first configuration, Zveno 1, was simple. One I-4 fighter under the TB-3 fuselage. Proof of concept, testing the idea. But Zveno 2 went further. 2 planes, one under the fuselage and one under the right wing. Then, under the left. Symmetry, balance. The aerodynamics start getting complicated, but the math holds up. Then comes Zveno 3, 3 fighters. Vakhmistrov changes the types of planes. He tries the I-5, then the I-15. Each machine behaves a little differently in the harness. Each requires its own trapeze, its own angle, its own detachment procedure. This isn't just engineering. This is the art of selection. But here's the interesting part. While Vakhmistrov was working in Moscow labs, something similar was happening on the other side of the planet. In the USA, the Navy was building 2 giant airships, the Akron and the Macon. Each could carry up to 5 small scout planes inside its hull, launch them in flight, and receive them back on a special hook trapeze. The British were experimenting too. The Germans were thinking in a similar direction. Imagine, several countries, independently of each other, secretly, without any exchange of information, arriving at the same idea, in the same decade. This either means the idea was absolutely logical, or the times themselves were pushing people toward this solution. But here's the difference. The American and British programs worked with airships. Slow, vulnerable, giant balloons filled with gas that would burn from a single spark. Vakhmistrov worked with a plane, with a metal, maneuverable combat aircraft. And that was the fundamental difference. By 1935, the Soviet Zveno program had gone further than any of its counterparts in the world in terms of depth of practical development. Not on paper, in the air, in real flights, with real pilots. By that time, Vakhmistrov had developed 12 different configurations, 12 suspension schemes, different planes, different mounting points, different missions. Some of them look so implausible that test pilots seeing the blueprints for the first time would ask, "Is this serious?" One scheme, Zveno 7, involved mounting 2 fighters not under the wings and not under the fuselage, but on top. On the wings of the TB-3, the plane stood on the giant's wing like toys on a shelf. Takeoff, together. Climbing, together. And then the pilots just started the engines, detached, and pulled up. Can you imagine that? Standing on the wing of a flying plane, at 2,000 meters, waiting for the command. But the most exotic configuration was still to come. Zveno SPB, a composite dive bomber. In this version, the I-16 fighters carried aerial bombs under their wings. The TB-3 would deliver them to the target area. They would detach, attack, and, pay attention, they wouldn't return to the mother ship. The pilot would complete the mission and land at the nearest available airfield. The plane was used as a disposable carrier for a precision strike. 80 years later, this would be called the disposable drone concept. But back then, it was called Zveno. And this was the configuration that eventually went into real combat. But before we get to that August of 1941, we need to talk about the people. The ones who sat in those cockpits, who clung to a trapeze at 3,000 meters, waiting for the order to detach. Who were these people, and how did they describe what they were doing? Let's forget about the blueprints for a minute, about the configurations, about the trapezes and aerodynamic calculations. Let's talk about the man in the cockpit. Imagine you are a pilot. You're in your early 20s. You know how to fly, and you fly well, or they wouldn't have picked you. You're used to the feeling of takeoff, that moment when the wheels leave the ground and you feel the elements accept you. But today, everything is different. Today, you aren't taking off. You are being lifted. Your plane is hanging under the belly of a giant on a metal trapeze. The engine is off. You're sitting in a closed cockpit, listening to 4 foreign motors roaring above your head. The ground is falling away, but not like during a takeoff. Smoothly, passively, as if you're being carried in someone's hands. That's a completely different sensation, and you can't get used to it. The pilots for the Zveno project were selected carefully. The criteria were unspoken, but understood by everyone in the program. You needed a person with flawless piloting technique. That goes without saying. But the main thing was psychological stability. The ability to act clearly in conditions your brain classifies as abnormal. Because everything in this situation was abnormal. You are hanging under someone else's plane. You aren't controlling your own movement. You depend on the pilot above you, on the mechanic who secured the trapeze, on the engineer who did the math. You are part of a system, and that required a special kind of character. Those who passed the selection process recalled later that the strangest thing wasn't hanging under the TB-3. The strangest thing was the moment of waiting for the detachment order. You're ready. The engine is warmed up, as much as possible in these conditions. Your hand is on the lever, and you wait. A second. 2. 5. One of the pilots described this moment, and I want to pass on his words precisely, because it couldn't be said better. He wrote in his memoirs something like this. It was like the Earth disappeared twice. First, when we took off, and again when I detached. Twice in one flight, you realize there is nothing underneath you. Twice in one flight. Think about that. At the same time, and this is important, the Zveno pilots weren't people seeking a thrill. By all accounts, they were calm, methodical professionals. People who treated their unusual job the same way an experienced surgeon treats a complex operation. Focused, without unnecessary emotions, with a full understanding of what they were doing and why. A special relationship developed between the TB-3 crew and the fighter pilots. It wasn't just professional interaction, it was interdependence. The pilot above was responsible for those hanging below him. The pilots below trusted their lives to those above. They say that before flights, they barely talked about what was coming. They discussed the weather, complained about the food, told stories, normal, not about flying. It was a way to remain human in inhumane circumstances. And that's what I want you to remember about these people. They didn't consider themselves heroes. They considered themselves specialists performing a complex technical task. The difference is huge. A hero acts in spite of fear. A specialist turns fear into a working tool. These were the kind of people the Zveno project needed. And these were the people who would one day receive a combat order. A real one, not a test. But before that moment, we need to understand one more thing. How did the military plan to use all this? What were the targets? What was the strategy? Because a wild idea only becomes a tool when someone understands exactly how to apply it. A good idea isn't everything. A good idea must meet the right question. And that question is simple. Why? Why exactly this way? What does it give that can't be achieved in another way? That was the exact question military strategists asked when Vakhmistrov came to them with yet another report on the tests. And it was the question he had to answer thoroughly. Let's break it down. You probably know how a naval aircraft carrier works. A huge ship carries planes across the ocean to where they wouldn't reach on their own. At the right point, the ship turns into the wind. The planes take off. They complete the mission. They return to the ship. The key word here is operational range. A plane can only fly as far as its fuel tank allows. The aircraft carrier solves this problem. It brings the plane closer to the target. Vakhmistrov proposed the same thing, but in the air. The TB-3 flies toward the target on its huge fuel tanks. On board, the fighters. They save fuel. They don't waste engine life. They arrive in the operation area fresh and ready for work. And then they detach and do what they were built to do. But that was only the first part of the equation. The second is even more interesting. The fighters of that time were small machines with a small payload. Traditionally, they weren't seen as carriers for precision strikes on specific targets. For that, there were bombers. Big, heavy, slow. But what if you need to hit not an area target, but a specific one? Not an airfield, but one specific object. Small, protected, difficult to reach? And that's where the Zveno SPB configuration came into the equation. 116 fighters with bombs under their wings. Fast, maneuverable, capable of diving on the target at a sharp angle, at a speed unavailable to a heavy bomber. Military strategists began to understand, and now pay attention, exactly what this was perfectly suited for. Bridges. Think about this target from a military logic perspective. A bridge is a narrow, long structure. Hitting it from horizontal flight at high altitude is extremely difficult. A heavy bomber flies straight and level, and most of the bombs miss. But a small plane, that's a different story. It can dive low, precisely, at the necessary angle. Where a heavy bomber is powerless, a small fighter with a bomb will succeed. Now add one more dimension to this. A bridge is usually guarded. Anti-aircraft guns, searchlights, patrol planes. If your bomber approaches from afar, they see it in advance. They have time to prepare, to intercept. But if the bomber approaches, and suddenly 5 maneuverable fighters burst from under its wings, that's a completely different story. That's surprise. That's speed. That's a strike they weren't prepared for. This was the logic Vakhmistrov and his allies in command laid out on the tables in staff offices. That's how an abstract idea turned into a concrete tactical tool. By the end of the 1930s, the concept was clearly formulated. Zveno wasn't a replacement for conventional aviation. It was a solution for tasks that conventional aviation couldn't handle. A precision instrument for precision targets. There was one thing left. Test it not at a test range, but in real conditions. On a real target. With real consequences. And that moment came. August 1941. That's where we are returning. To those 5 planes we left hanging under the wings of the TB-3 at the very beginning of this video. Now, when you know everything, we can finally finish watching that scene to the end. Here we are back again. August 1941. Altitude 3,000 meters. Under the wings of the TB-3, 5 I-16 fighters. 5 pilots. 5 people who know everything you now know. They passed the selection. They flew hundreds of hours in the harness. They know how their machine behaves at the moment of detachment. They are ready. The target is a bridge over the Danube near Chernovoda, a strategic object, a railway crossing used for supply trains. Removing this bridge means cutting a vital artery. Traditional methods hadn't worked. The target was too narrow, too well defended. That is why Zveno is here. The group commander receives the report on reaching the designated line. He looks down. Somewhere there, through the haze, should be the river, and the bridge over it. Prepare for detachment. 5 hands simultaneously rest on the levers. 5 engines are warmed up, as much as the conditions of the suspension allow. 5 pilots do a final check of the cockpit. Quick, professional, without wasted movement. Go. And there it is. 5 clicks. Almost simultaneously. 5 machines fall downward for a fraction of a second, and 5 engines catch them. The group fans out. Alive. Fast. Free. The TB-3 turns and leaves. Its job is done. Now, only them. The commander leads the group into a dive. The speed increases. Below, the glitter of water. The river. And across it, a thin, dark line of the bridge. The first pass. The pilots see the target. The calculations are done. The dive angle is off. The wind pushed the group further to the right than needed. The bombs will miss. The commander makes an instantaneous decision. Pull out, second pass. In a normal situation, a second pass is a risk, a huge risk. The anti-aircraft crews already know you're here. They are already turning their guns. They are already waiting. But the commander turns the group around. The second pass starts at a lower altitude. The angle is different. The speed is higher. The bridge is in the sights. Think about this moment. 5 small planes in low-level flight over the river. Below, water. Ahead, the bridge. Somewhere nearby, anti-aircraft fire. And every pilot knows that the next few seconds will decide everything. The bombs drop. A second of waiting, infinitely long. Then, impacts. The bridge shakes. The span is damaged. Traffic across the crossing is stopped. 5 fighters pull away at low altitude. The group scatters, each one to the nearest available landing point. They won't return to the mothership. The mission is accomplished. Zveno SPB has just conducted the first successful combat operation of an aerial aircraft carrier in history. Vakhmistrov received the report on the mission's results that same day. What he felt, history remains silent. In the documents, there are only dry lines of a report. Coordinates, time, result. But behind these lines, 10 years of work. 10 years of convincing and calculating. 10 years of skeptical looks and cautious wording in reports. And one phrase I want to add. He was right. The idea worked. The system worked. The people succeeded. It would seem this is it, the triumph. The start of a new era of aerial aircraft carriers. A logical development of success. Scaling, new operations, new configurations. But history rarely follows a logical path. And what happened next to the Zveno project is, perhaps, the most unexpected turn in this whole story. There is a special kind of injustice in the world of technology. Not when an idea turns out to be bad. Not when it doesn't work. But when it works, and the world moves on in a different direction. When you turn out to be right, but it no longer matters. That is exactly what happened to the Zveno project. After the 1941 operation, one might have expected a continuation. Development, new combat sorties, expansion of the program. Logic suggested exactly that. The system had proven its worth in real conditions. So, move forward. But logic and reality are two different things. The first problem was the TB-3 itself. The same giant that made all this possible, by the start of 1941, was already a veteran. It was designed in the late 20s. Its speed, its altitude, its specifications. All this was the norm for 1932. But not for 1941. Aviation had taken huge leaps forward in 10 years. New fighters flew twice as fast as the TB-3. Anti-aircraft artillery had become more accurate and longer ranged. And here, the main vulnerability of the entire system was exposed. The TB-3 with fighters attached was a huge, slow target. Think about this picture from the enemy's point of view. You see a giant plane in the sky. Slow, predictable, with extra machines under its wings that make it even more cumbersome. It's not a threat, it's a target. As long as Zveno operated under the element of surprise, it worked. But surprise is a non-renewable resource. After the first operations, the enemy knew what to expect, and the TB-3 with its 200 kilometers per hour became extremely vulnerable on the approach to the target. The second problem was logistics. A Zveno operation required precise coordination of many elements. You needed a functional TB-3, not one, but several in reserve. You needed specially trained fighter pilots, people with unique training who couldn't be replaced overnight. You needed special trapezes, special equipment, special procedures. In the conditions of intense combat operations, this became a heavy burden. Resources went where the payoff was faster and easier. The third problem, and perhaps the deepest, was that aviation was evolving in a direction that made Zveno gradually redundant. New planes with longer flight ranges were appearing. Targeting systems were improving. New types of ammunition were being developed. The tasks for which Zveno was a unique tool were starting to be solved by other means. And here is the promised irony. The Zveno project wasn't closed because it failed. It was closed because everything around it started working better. Because the world was moving fast, and what was a breakthrough yesterday became a niche solution today, and a museum piece tomorrow. This is perhaps the rarest and bitterest way to fade into the shadows, when your correctness is no longer needed by anyone. In 1944, Vakhmistrov submitted the last reports on the program. The project officially ceased to exist. The engineer continued working in the aviation industry, quietly, without high-profile positions, without public recognition. His name almost disappeared from the official history of aviation. Almost. Because an idea doesn't disappear. It fades into the shadows. It waits. And one day it returns. In a different form, with different technologies, under a different name. But before we get to that return, let's take a step back. A wide step. And look at the whole picture. Because the story of Zveno isn't just a Soviet story. It's a story of an idea that emerged in several points on the planet simultaneously. And that, in itself, tells us something very important. Here is a question I thought about for a long time. How is it that several countries, independently of each other, under strict secrecy, without any exchange of information, arrive at the same idea, practically simultaneously, with a difference of a few years? It either means the idea was absolutely inevitable, or that all these people, Soviet engineers, American admirals, British designers, looked at the same world and saw the same problem. Let's look at the whole picture. The United States, early 30s. The Navy is building two giant airships, the Akron and the Macon. Each is almost 250 meters long. Inside the hull is a special hangar. In this hangar are up to 5 small scout planes like the F-9C Sparrowhawk. The launch and retrieval system is strikingly similar to the Soviet trapeze. The plane would exit the hangar from below through a special hatch. It would hook onto a moving trapeze and enter free flight. It would return the same way, hook itself onto the trapeze right in midair, and go back into the hangar. Beautiful, elegant, almost fantastical. But the airships turned out to be death traps in bad weather. The Akron crashed in 1933 during a storm. The Macon in 1935. Both programs closed along with the ships. Britain went its own way. British experiments with attaching planes to airships were conducted as early as the 20s. Less massive, less systemic, but the idea itself was the same. And now, the most interesting comparison. Germany, during the Second World War, developed a concept called Mistel, from the German word for mistletoe. It was a fundamentally different solution to the same task. An old plane, past its operational life, was packed with explosives and attached under a fighter. The fighter pilot would deliver this bundle to the target, detach the lower plane at the right moment, and it would fly on by itself, like a huge guided bomb. The concept is different, but the route is the same. One plane carries another. A big one carries a small one, or vice versa. Now look at it all from a height. 4 countries, 4 independent programs, 4 teams of engineers who didn't know about each other, and all 4 arrived at the principle of an aerial carrier. at the idea that one flying craft could deliver another to where it couldn't reach on its own. This is no coincidence. This is a response to the same question. A question that the aviation of that time was putting to everyone simultaneously. How do you overcome the limitation of operational range? How do you deliver a combat unit exactly where it's needed? And here is what is striking. The Soviet Zveno program, among all these analogs, went further than anyone in practical terms. Not on paper, not in test flights over a closed range, but in a real combat operation with a real result. The American airships crashed in a storm without ever using their planes in battle. The British experiments remained experiments. The German Mistels were used, but that was a concept of last resort, of despair, not a developed system. Zveno is the only program that reached combat application in the form it was originally intended. Vakhmistrov, most likely, never fully learned about the American airships. He didn't know the details of the British experiments. He worked in his own space, with his own team, in his own conditions, and arrived at the same conclusion, independently. That tells us something important, not about Soviet aviation, not about American airships, but about the very nature of good ideas. A right idea at the right time, it emerges on its own. It's as if it's hanging in the air, and sooner or later, someone grabs it. All these programs were closed. All went into archives. It seemed forever. But right ideas don't disappear. They just wait. And in 2015, one American research organization opened old folders with blueprints and started asking very familiar questions. 2015, Washington. The research agency of the U.S. Department of Defense, DARPA, announces the start of a new program. The name of the program, Gremlins. If you're familiar with aviation folklore, you'll smile. Gremlins in flight mythology are small, mischievous creatures that supposedly break planes from the inside. Pilots invented them during the Second World War as an explanation for unexplainable breakdowns. Non-existent passengers, invisible fellow travelers. DARPA took this word and invested it with a completely new meaning. The idea of the Gremlins program was this: a transport plane, large, long-range, launches a swarm of small, unmanned vehicles in the air. They perform a mission, reconnaissance, electronic warfare, targeting, and then they return. Not to an airfield, back on board the flying carrier plane. Read that again. A big plane carries small ones, launches them at the right point, takes them back in mid-air. If it feels like you've heard this before, you aren't wrong. The difference is in the details and in the scale of capabilities. Vakhmistrov worked with manned fighters. DARPA works with drones. Vakhmistrov used a mechanical trapeze and a hook. DARPA is developing automated docking systems. Vakhmistrov did it manually, with the precision of human reaction. Modern systems work with the precision of an onboard computer. But the principle is the same. Absolutely the same principle that Vakhmistrov drew in his Moscow office in 1928. The Gremlins program was developed for several years. Tests were conducted, docking systems were refined, aerodynamic problems were solved, the same problems that Vakhmistrov solved manually, by eye, with a notebook in his hands. And then, October 2021, a test range in the state of Utah. A C-130 transport plane flies at an altitude of several thousand meters. The X-61A unmanned vehicle has completed its mission, and now it is returning. An automatic guidance system leads the drone exactly to the tail section of the C-130. A special capture mechanism secures it. The drone is brought on board. The first successful automated return of a drone to a flying plane in history. When I read the description of this test, I thought of one person. Of the quiet Moscow engineer who wrote similar reports 90 years ago. Who stood on a cold Moscow airfield with a notebook in his hands and watched his idea tear itself away from the ground for the first time. I wonder, would he have smiled? But Gremlins isn't the only modern echo of Zveno. In 2019, the US Navy successfully tested the Locust system, a swarm of small drones launched from a ship or plane. In the 2020s, the concept of an aerial carrier for unmanned vehicles is being discussed in the military doctrines of several countries. The term aerial aircraft carrier, the same term that sounded like science fiction in the 1930s, is now used calmly in official technical documents. The idea has returned, not as nostalgia, not as a museum piece, as a living, developing concept with specific budgets and specific tests. Vakhmistrov didn't live to see this. His name is not mentioned in DARPA press releases. No one in Californian research centers hangs his portrait on the wall. But that doesn't change one simple fact. He was the first, before everyone else, further than everyone else. With fewer resources, with more primitive tools, in more difficult conditions, he realized what modern technology returns to again and again. And now we have reached the last question, the most important one. Not about planes, not about drones, not about trapezes and docking systems, about what all this means, about people who see further than others, and about what happens to their ideas when the world finally catches up to them. Let's go back to the beginning. August 1941, 3,000 meters altitude. 5 fighters under the wings of a giant. 5 pilots waiting for the command. We looked at this picture at the very beginning of the video, and it seemed impossible, almost absurd. One plane carrying 5 others. In the air. In a real sky. Not in a movie. But now you know everything behind it. You know the man who invented it. You know the machine that made it possible. You know the pilots who carried it out. And you know that this idea still lives today. In a different form, with different technologies, but with the same heart. And now I want to ask you a question. What makes an idea great? Not success, not recognition, not money or titles. History is full of people who received all that and were forgotten in a generation. A great idea is made great by one property. It returns. It can be closed. It can be put in an archive. It can be omitted from textbooks. But if an idea answers a real question, it doesn't disappear. It waits, patiently, as long as necessary, until technology catches up to imagination, until the world is ready for it again. Vakhmistrov wasn't a recognized genius in his lifetime. He didn't get the place in aviation history he deserved. Only those who specifically look for his name know it. But look at what he left behind. The principle of the aerial carrier lives. The concept of delivering combat units to a point of application on board a carrier plane is evolving. The idea he drew in his office nearly 100 years ago is discussed today in research centers with multi-billion-dollar budgets. That is the true immortality of an idea. I think about this. Every generation has its Vakhmistrovs. People who see a solution before the world is ready to accept it. Who write reports that get filed away. Who convince skeptics. Who work in silence and secrecy, and often pass away without seeing the full result of their labor. We rarely know their names, but their ideas we use every day. In technologies that seem obvious to us, in solutions we take for granted. Behind each one is someone's notebook, someone's cold airfield, someone's years of work without guarantees of a result. That is what the story of Zveno tells us. Not about planes, about people. And that is what I want you to take away with you after this video. Not the technical specifications of the TB-3, not the diagram of Vakhmistrov's trapeze, not the coordinates of the bridge over the Danube, but this feeling. When you look at something that seems impossible and understand that behind it stands just a person, with a notebook, with a pencil, and with an idea that gave him no peace. 5 planes under the wings of a giant. August 1941. Altitude 3,000 meters. It was possible. It happened. And somewhere right now, someone is drawing the next impossible thing. Thank you for watching until the end. It matters, not just for the channel. It matters because stories like this must be told. Because people like Vakhmistrov deserve to be remembered.